following is a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.
Meet Professor Roger Hill, historian, adventurer, and raconteur extraordinaire. He travels to parallel worlds where history went differently and brings back lectures on his findings. So grab a prime seat, pay attention, and take good notes. This is Alternate History 100. Welcome to the class.
Good morning. Thank you. First day of the new semester. Welcome to Alternate History 100. I'm
Isn't this Geography 100?
No, this isn't Geography 100. That's in Hatcher Hall. If that's what you signed up for, you better get there in a hurry. You need to get much better at reading maps. Oh, let's not be mean. Everybody has a first day. And as our misplaced friend slides out, let's get back to business. This is Alternate History 100, and I'm Professor Hill. And let us begin by asking, what is alternate history? Well, let's take a look at your own life. You are here because you chose to take this course. And you did that because you got into this university. And you did that because you did well in high school. And if any link in that chain of events is broken, you are somewhere else. And someone else is sitting in your seat. That's alternate history. You're here in this world because your parents got together and made you. And if that didn't happen, you wouldn't exist at all. That's alternate history. During this course, I will tell you of my visits to parallel worlds where things did go differently. We'll talk about decisions and errors and accidents that affected everything that followed. We'll discuss how perceptions of people and events can be altered. We'll debate the validity of the great man theory and explore whether history is just a series of waves and inevitabilities. We'll even do a couple where we completely break the mold. Sound like fun? Then let's get started. One of the most common questions I get as an alternate historian is, what if Columbus hadn't discovered America? And you can stow the political correctness on this one. I know that the natives were well aware of this land long before 1492, and I know that the Vikings were here 500 years before Columbus. But the natives had no communication with the rest of the world. They weren't tweeting about how great the fishing was in 1491 or taking selfies at Niagara Falls. And the Vikings? Knowledge of their visits was lost and not found again until the 20th century. So, from a European perspective, it was very much a discovery. And as things go, it was one of the most important things to happen in the second millennium. It's right up there with the printing press, the Declaration of Independence, and the first issue of Superman. You think I'm kidding. But if you had that comic, you could sell it for $1 million and you wouldn't need to go to college. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You learned that poem in elementary school. But in the other world I went to, nobody knows that rhyme. Let's talk about that. Over there, Queen Isabella financed the Columbus expedition just like she did here. But unlike our world, her Columbus never came back. Were the ships lost at sea? Did the sailors fall prey to disease? Did they just find some beach and spend the rest of their lives drinking rum and playing volleyball? That's what I would have done. Nobody knows. Even in their 21st century, it's a mystery. And in their 15th century? Well, let's come back to our world to answer that question. Our Columbus did come back. He landed in Lisbon on March 4th, 1493, and sent a letter about his discoveries to the Spanish court. In the letter, he talked about a series of islands in what he believed to be the Indian Ocean, which is why he called the people he found there Indians. He talked about the wealth of the islands and the docile people all ready for conversion to Mother Church. And he asked for another expedition. "Oh, please, Auntie Isabella, can I have the ships again? I'll bring home gold and turn all those nice people into Christians." Well, it worked. But not only with Queen Isabella. This letter went viral. Via a new thing called the printing press, it was published in Barcelona by April and in a Latin translation by May. By the end of 1493, everybody in Europe knew there was something out there. And the Portuguese wanted it. Indeed, they thought the Spanish were trespassing on their turf. "Yo, Holmes, what you doing on my block? Am I going to have to cut you?" Thank you. I see a couple of sour faces out there, but most of you liked it, and stuff like that does help you remember. Now, Pope Alexander VI was afraid they might go to war over this, so he issued bulls setting up a line from pole to pole, passing 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Spain was given dominion over all non-Christian lands west of the line, and Portugal got all lands to the east. Basically, the Pope had given North and South America to the Spanish, and Africa and Asia to the Portuguese. Of course, he didn't bother consulting the people who already lived in those places. Now, Portugal wanted a little more wiggle room, so they negotiated a move of the line via the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. This gave them the east coast of Brazil, and it's why, if you go to Rio for Carnival today, you say Bom dia instead of Buenos dias. So everything was divvied up, and the age of exploration was on. But that's our world. In this other world, Columbus didn't come home. There was no letter, no gold, no tales of wealth, no souls to be won. And without that, no inspiration to try again. And even if there was inspiration, there was no money to pay for it. Remember that Isabella had borrowed to finance this expedition. When it produced no results, she was like your parents will be if you flunk out of school, reluctant to spend again. So the Spanish of that world sat back to lick the financial wounds of the failed mission. But that didn't mean that others weren't still in the game. The desire to find a sea route to Asia was kind of like the space race of the 1960s, but with more than two powers in contention. The Portuguese thought they could find a way to Asia by sailing around Africa and sent Vasco da Gama to make it happen. And an Italian explorer named John Cabot found a sponsor for another transatlantic mission in King Henry VII of England. Both these men set out in the year 1497. Cabot found an island that he rather unimaginatively named Newly Found Land. You figure out for yourself where that was. And he poked around the area by sea, but barely went ashore. He found no cities, no gold, and made no contact with the people living there. The only wealth he found was in the great schools of fish that lived in those waters. Still, he saw enough to convince himself that he was in Asia. There was no one there to tell him that Asia was in Hatcher Hall. He went home to tell King Henry the news, and somehow his minimal findings were enough to convince the notoriously stingy Henry to finance another expedition. That one set out in 1498. One of Cabot's ships had to turn back after suffering storm damage near Ireland, but the others went on, and John Cabot was never heard from again. Were his remaining ships lost at sea? Did the mariners fall prey to disease? I know they didn't find a tropical beach to play volleyball on in Newfoundland, but maybe they stayed for the free Canadian health care. That's what I would have done. Nobody knows what happened to them. There are some modern suggestions that at least one of the ships made it back, but nobody thought that back then. They just gave Cabot up for dead in 1499. 1499. In that same year, Vasco da Gama returned home to Portugal. He brought back maps, spices, jewels, silk, and a few unwilling Indians as proof of his success in finding a sea route to Asia. He was richly rewarded, and Portugal began sending annual armadas to trade with India. And these made Portugal wealthy and powerful. So what do you suppose Spain did? Do you think they tried another transatlantic mission when 2 of the 3 previous ones were lost and the third had come home empty-handed? No, they went with the proven route, and that's where things took a sharp diversion from our world. Now let's remember that one of the purposes of the original Columbus expedition was to find territory and win souls for the church. It was buried in the Find a Sea Route to Asia mission, but it was there. And when the Spanish saw that the Portuguese planned little more for Africa than a few ports on the east coast where they might take on supplies and make repairs, they decided to pounce. They established a colony of what we call Cape Town, Cruz del Cabo in their world, in the year 1500. And boy, were the Portuguese pissed when they learned about it. "Yo, Holmes, what you doing on my block? Am I going to have to cut you?" They almost went to war, but like our world, there was a papal bull from Pope Alexander VI. He stepped in and drew a line on a map, giving Africa north of the 26th parallel of south latitude to Portugal, and south of that line to Spain in 1501. Again, without consulting the people who already lived there. The Spanish colony at Cruz del Cabo remained, and another followed, Puerto Isabella, Port Elizabeth in our world, in 1502. Now this meant Europeans were in southern Africa on a permanent basis about 150 years before it happened in our world. And just like here, they brought with them diseases like smallpox, to which the Africans had no more immunity than the Native Americans of our world did. The populations of Khoikhoi and Xhosa people in that world plummeted in the first half of their 16th century. The missions at Cabo del Cruz and Puerto Isabella began converting the Africans to Catholicism and spreading the Spanish language inland from the coast. The colonies were self-sustaining from raising cattle and crops, but they did not initially send much back to Spain. But hang on to your cuirass. Wait till you see what happened next. In 1504, an 18-year-old named Hernan Cortez arrived at Cabo del Cruz. He registered as a citizen and was given land to farm. Smart and ambitious, he soon rose to a position of prominence in that world's new Spain. And he became aware that the natives the colony traded with often brought gold and diamonds and seemed to place very little value on them, as if they were a common thing. He wanted to take an expedition north to find the source of this wealth, but was forbidden by the governor to do so. So, he went anyway. This trek took him to what the natives called the Great River or the Black River. It's the Orange River in our world, and its banks were laden with alluvial diamonds. He also found the gold-bearing ridge that we call Witwatersrand, or, if you prefer, Witwatersrand. He called it Cresta de Agua Blanca for short. He quickly conquered the natives and established a community called Rio Dorado. Mines were dug and huge quantities of gold and diamonds were extracted and sent back to Spain. This treasure made Spain wealthy and powerful for the rest of the 16th century, which is just like here, except that there the wealth came from Africa and not the Americas. So what of the Americas? Well, explorers from England and France eventually came to North America. But the initial ones like Jacques Cartier and Martin Frobisher were simply looking for a way around this obstacle on the route to Asia. It was not until the 17th century that any lasting colonies were founded. And South America? Well, the Portuguese had their trade routes, and the Spanish were quite busy with their empire in Africa. This meant that Europeans left South America alone for far longer than they did in our world. No one showed any interest when some guy named Magellan showed up with a plan to reach the Pacific via a southern passage. It was not until 1577 that such an attempt was made. Sir Francis Drake, sailing under the flag of England, crossed the Atlantic and mapped the coast of the new lands. He decided that they were a massive single continent and not just an island. He named the new continent Virginia in honor of his queen. Geographers later divided it into North, Central, and South Virginia. Those names have lasted to this day. Drake continued along the coast and entered the Pacific via Drake Strait. What a coincidence! He made it to Asia and from there went back to England via the established Portuguese trade routes. On his way back, he had to fight Spanish ships in the South Atlantic, but he was able to defeat them and bring his precious maps home. I think that's enough lecture for today. Let's get to your assignment. I've brought back lots of books, records, and maps from that world, and you are free to borrow them. Your term assignment is to write 25 pages on this alternate world. Here are some suggested topics. Compare and contrast the development of sub-Saharan Africa between that world and ours. You could research the rise to nationhood of the Latin African states of that world, which happened in their 19th century. You could talk about the parallels with our South America. Or you could check out the maps of that world and discuss how and why their African borders are so different from ours. Or you could compare and contrast the history of the Americas between that world and ours. What was it like for the natives of the North Virginian plains to not have horses as soon as they did in our world? What was the native population of North or South Virginia in a world where the introduction of smallpox was delayed by more than a century? What happened to the Aztecs and the Incas in a world where they were not conquered in the 1500s? You can write about history, geography, politics, culture. It's all fair game. All the research material can be freely borrowed from me. Dig into it like Cortez dug into the gold deposits at... Rio Dorado. Very good, Maria. I cannot roll my R's like that. Class dismissed. Hi, I'm Gary Wheeler. Alternate History 100 is a labor of love with the twin goals of entertaining you and making you think. If you like what you heard today, please hit the subscribe button, give us a like, and tell your friends about us. Your word of mouth can really help this channel grow. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Until then, keep thinking and make some history of your own.
The preceding was a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.